Welcome to Solly
Gauta
UNCUT. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another session of Solly Gauta UNCUT. This time we're being joined by Hilary Joffe. Many of you will know her as the contributing editor to Business Times. Very, very erudite, expressive journalists in this area of where South Africa is going economically, what decisions we're doing right and wrong, what needs to change in order to prevent South Africa from going into the wrong direction. The key discussion for today is South African government corruption and ineptitude, as well as reckless borrowing. To what extent is this driving South Africa to the fiscal cliff? Join us as we tackle this topic today.
Hilary, what is a fiscal cliff, for those who don't know?
It's a term that some economists like to use. It's not one which I use. I do think it's the point at which, if you like, the risk that we go into a debt crisis really looms. And I think the finance minister has said that if we do not take action to rein in public spending, we face a sovereign debt crisis within 2 or 3 years. Now, what that would mean is that as a country, we would be unable to pay our debts, if you like. We would be unable to service the interest on the public debt. We would face a situation in which we would be starting to choose between, do we pay the interest or do we pay social grants? Do we have enough cash to pay civil servants? So that debt crisis, which I think a lot of emerging market countries have run into and had to be bailed out of in the last many decades, is something which South Africa now faces within 2 or 3 years if it does not do something to get its public finances back into balance.
Hilary, in South Africa, unfortunately, we're dealing with a governing party that is split in at least 2 halves, it appears. I don't know how equal they are. Do you think they understand this? Do you think that there's unity within the governing party as to the difficult decisions that have to be taken in order to avoid falling over the cliff?
I think, as you say, Solly, it's a political problem. It's not a budgetary problem, because the budget is really just a reflection of a whole set of political choices about what you spend your money on. And indeed, I think the political splits within the party are such that it will be very difficult to find consensus on what needs to be done. And there is not nearly a sufficient sense of crisis, I think, across a lot of stakeholders. Government, labor, a lot of NGOs, there's a sense that government can afford to spend more to get the economy out of trouble, that we still have infinite resources, and we really, really don't. And there's no sense of that kind of crisis that as a country we are actually running out of money. And I think another important element of the lack of consensus that you talk about is that economic growth would solve a lot of these problems. If you had a dynamic, growing economy that was generating new jobs, new businesses, new taxes, a lot of those fiscal issues go away. The problems of how to spend more on social grants or whatever just go away if you've got more tax revenue to fund them. What we don't have is economic growth. And of course, in the crisis, we've got minus. I mean, we're going to have an economy which is shrinking by 8 or 10% this year and not growing very much in the next few years. But even before the crisis, the economy was growing by far less than the population was growing. So as a country, per head, we were going backwards. Our incomes were actually falling in real terms. So that growth problem is really the fundamental problem that the budget problem in a way reflects. And until we get growth, we can't really solve that fiscal problem in any way that is acceptable to us as a country. But there's not enough will or consensus within the ruling alliance on what you need to do to get growth. Because I think a lot of economists will say, at this point, the government has no money. The only way to get growth is to really get the private sector to invest. But that requires a whole lot of decisions, which I don't think are very palatable in the ANC.
For the private sector to trust government, which I'm not sure it does at this stage, and it has all the reasons in the world not to trust government, there's got to be, for them to put money into the economy, they have to trust government. Do you think government appreciates the importance of reputation, of trust, of creating a general environment of goodwill so that both investors that are sitting in South Africa and that are looking at South Africa from outside will trust that if they put money in, especially over the medium to long term, into this market, they would be putting it in the right hands?
Lee, I think we're a bit beyond trust here and reputation. I think if the private sector doesn't see concrete evidence that the government is prepared to make changes in the environment for investment, they can't invest, because private sector investors, and we're not talking only about businesses as such, we're talking about the huge pension funds in which workers' money is invested, who look after workers' retirement savings. That's what we're talking about also when we talk about private sector funding for infrastructure or whatever. Now, that money has to be invested in a way that gets returns. And unless the environment is there in which businesses can make profits, and investors, including pension funds, can get returns on their investment, the private sector is not going to put that money in. And I think government is very good at talking, and we've got another one of President Cyril Ramaphosa's investment conferences coming next week, at which he's going to try and talk up the market again. But we have had promises over many, many years from government of the things it's going to do, from fixing Eskom to releasing the broadband spectrum, which we all desperately need to release data and bring down data costs and allow us to have a digital economy, to making it easier to do business by eliminating the red tape and the dysfunction that goes on in the government bureaucracy that people have to deal with all the time. Unless there is really concrete evidence that the president is going to fix those, not talk about fixing them, I don't think you are going to get investment. And without private sector investment, you are not going to get higher rates of economic growth.
There's been suggestions that there's a lot of policy uncertainty. Policy uncertainty regarding expropriation without compensation, mining policy, BE policy, as you say, spectrum, also decisions regarding the unbundling of Eskom. A whole lot of structural issues seem to deter business confidence and therefore also consumer confidence. What do you think about that? How big a role does policy uncertainty play as far as deterring foreign investment and local investment?
Indeed, yeah. And I think sometimes business gets itself into trouble because it talks about policy uncertainty, and it doesn't really mean uncertainty. It means business unfriendly policies.
Yes.
What is needed is, number one, the kind of policies that actively encourage private sector investment. And in some ways that would mean government just getting out of the way. letting the private sector invest in energy, for example, which the private sector is desperate to do, not only for their own use, but also because it's a very good investment. You know, we all want to do green. There's lots of money for green energy. There's lots of money available for renewable energy. The private sector is really desperate to do that kind of investment, but government needs to get out of the way and let it happen. And the same goes in a whole lot of other areas where the private sector would be keen to invest, but government needs to make it easy. So I think it's business-friendly policy, if you like, not just certainty on the one hand, but also, you know what, one of the biggest impediments, I think, is this kind of policy paralysis and this incapacity of the state. It sometimes feels like to do anything at all. And I think, you know, we're battling with that as a country. You know, the president makes announcements and kind of nothing happens. The spectrum thing we have been waiting for 10 years. Now it's been promised for March. We'll see if it happens, because I think it actually has to happen to give that signal to the private sector that it is now open for investment. Because until it actually happens, until an infrastructure project actually happens and is made possible, until the energy minister and the energy regulator don't only talk about licensing for new investments, but actually start the process, I think we're at the point where there have been so many promises over so many years that you need some very clear signals that it's happening. And we need the president to come back and say, we did this, this, and that, and the other. And that's where you'd get that confidence. And that's where you'd get that willingness to invest, because the private sector would then be able to see the way forward to making profits, and therefore would be willing to invest.
Now, it would seem that the problem is the African National Congress. Its inability to move beyond the anti-capitalist trap, the anti-capitalism ideology in which they've entrapped themselves, and the corruption that is destroying even consumer confidence in the municipalities. People are not getting jobs. People are not. Projects are not being implemented because of corruption. Infrastructure projects are hijacked, and there's no policing. There's no effective policing there. One wonders what kind of competitive environment do we present as a country when there are other competing markets outside of South Africa.
I think the competitive environment is a very good way of putting it. That's what we need. And you'll see on all the international rankings, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business, the World Economic Forum, Global Competitiveness Ranking. If you look at how we've done over the past 10 years, we have slid very steeply down the rankings. So it's exactly that competitive environment that is missing. It is probably too simple to attribute it only to the ruling party, but I think our political forces in this country and our government itself has become terribly dysfunctional. Mm-hmm. So I think it is both of those things. I think it is not only the ANC, but perhaps the whole alliance and the kind of stakeholders which have to be mollified, or which it's felt have to be mollified. It's a sort of alignment of forces, but it's also the state itself, which really is not a state with any capacity to make this happen. And you see that in the things like the Ease of Doing Business rankings, which actually measures, in many ways, the competence and effectiveness of your bureaucracy.
Let's talk a bit about the trade unions, the role they play in our space. And now that we're heading to another year of elections next year, hopefully they don't get to postpone them as the EFF and the ANC have been trying to propose. Do you think the ANC has the courage to say to the trade unions, you need to back off, because we need to make really difficult decisions here for South Africa, for the future. We're not going to get out of this situation and so, save South Africa from falling over the cliff if we don't cut, for instance, the number of people that we're employing in government, the closer we move to the elections, the harder it gets for the ANC to put its foot down. Do you think, I mean, where is this going? What, do you think the trade unions are too strong in South Africa?
I think we know that the public sector unions are too strong in South Africa, and that is reflected in the fact that, you know, we are now spending 10 to 15% of our GDP. Basically 10% to 15% of our economy is going to pay public servants, which is higher than most countries. It's well more than a third, approaching 40% of government spending, and it's been stuck there for many years. And it's not as if we're getting fantastic returns on that investment, if you like, because we don't have the kind of service delivery and the really kind of great public sector that we would like to see, and the teachers that would give us the kind of educational outcomes we want to see. So yes, I think it is in significant part a product of the strength of the public sector unions and the fact that they are dominant in COSATU, which is a partner in the alliance. So yes, as you say, it's very hard for government to take them on. I think it should be concern to all of us that the unions themselves are sort of almost stuck on this old path of we are defending our rights. At a time when it seems more and more inappropriate. On the one hand, we've got this fiscal crisis, this potential sovereign debt crisis that the government is facing. And the biggest chunk, I mean, it's tried over the past few years to address the imbalance in the public finances every which way. The biggest last thing which has to be tackled and cannot be avoided is the public sector wage bill, which has gone up way ahead of inflation over the past decade and has grown much faster than the economy has grown. And so we have an economy which increasingly just can't support this public sector wage bill, which, according to a recent study which was done for Business Unity South Africa, 80% of the growth in the public sector wage bill is just because public servants are being paid more, not because there are more of them. They're just getting higher and higher wages. Now, at a time like this, in the COVID crisis, many people in the private sector have lost jobs, have taken pay cuts, and that's across the spectrum. I think even from executives to junior workers, a lot of people have, if they've managed to hold onto their jobs at all, many people had no income during the lockdown, they just didn't get paid. Or, even in my company, we took 30% salary cuts. Yep. I think in a lot of voluntarily or enforced, a lot of companies took pay cuts in the private sector. Nobody in the public sector took a pay cut, and that was despite the fact that in many government departments they basically shut down for the lockdown. And I'm not hearing from the public sector unions any shift in position. I think the finance minister has tried to say we all have to make sacrifices. Business Unity South Africa, with a study that it shared with us the other day, has said, something radical needs to change here. And one is not seeing any sort of repositioning from the public sector unions to take account of the fact that the world and South Africa have really changed pretty fundamentally as a result of COVID, and that we all sort of need to look at a new world in which we might have to operate very differently, and the constraints might be very different on the one hand, but also the fact that South Africa's public finances are in crisis on the other. And as we go into the public sector wage negotiations next year, I think we're in for quite a rough time, because there isn't really another way at this point you can address the fiscal crisis, the fiscal cliff, as you've called it, There's a public sector wage bill and there's growth. And for both of those, you need the political will to enable some hard choices.
Let's talk about growth. Do you think a basic income grant for, say, 1 year, paying all the unemployed people, 13 million unemployed people, 1,000 rand a month, would take the economy to a higher growth trajectory, to generate the necessary revenue, tax revenue for the state, and generate aggregate demand?
With what money?
With what money?
Are you going to pay a basic income grant?
Borrowed money.
You know how much government is going to be in this current year? Do you know how much government is borrowing?
7 billion a week.
777 billion rand for the year. That is what government is borrowing. It is borrowing, I think there was a figure of 2 billion rand a day. And don't think we can rely on, you talked about the BRICS Bank and the IMF. Of that 777 billion, only about 100 billion of that is coming from the IMF and the World Bank, despite all the kind of, publicity that is received. It's nice to have that money, but most of that money is coming from the bond market, from private markets. Now that is money from private markets, which is basically private savings that is going to fund government's debt, which is not being spent to invest in other job-creating projects.
Infrastructure.
Yes. So we have to think very carefully about when we talk about more government borrowing. As it is, because government is now borrowing so much, it's borrowing actually more than we as South Africa save in a year.
Yes.
And it's very dependent on foreign investors who are not so interested in us anymore, which is one of the reasons we face a debt crisis, because foreign investors had fallen a bit out of love with South Africa, and we really rely on them to help fund that 777 billion, and they're not so keen. So the result is that the cost of borrowing keeps going up. Because supply and demand will match somehow, but the cost of government borrowing, especially for the longer term borrowing that government has to do, has gone very high. And that means that across the economy, the cost of longer term borrowing is kind of going very high. So as a country, that borrowing that government's doing really affects us in many ways. It weighs on our growth. It weighs on the interest rates we all pay in the end. And it weighs on government's ability to fund basic income grants. I happen not to believe it's the solution to anything. And of course, people who get basic income grants don't pay tax, so none of it comes back. I think we've got to think carefully about what we want the government to spend on and borrow for, because we already are in this kind of debt trap where nearly, the government's raising taxes from all of us. Of the tax money that the government raises, it's heading up to nearly a quarter of it. It's currently at about 21%, is going to just pay the interest on the government debt. When we talk about a fiscal cliff and a debt crisis, that's what we're talking about, where you're borrowing more and more, it's costing you more and more, you're spending more and more just to pay the interest and pay the debt back, and then you've got less and less to pay social grants, schools, clinics, medicines.
Last year, or this year, early this year, Team South Africa went to Davos, to the World Economic Forum. You might recall that Richard Quest, the editor, the business editor at large for CNN, gave us a really hard time, and he asked all the hard questions. Now, one of the things that he said to South Africa is, you guys can't come here and tell us to invest in South Africa when you don't even have the policies to support what you're saying, and all the corruption dealing with and all that. Do you think in 3 months' time, when Team South Africa returns to Davos, it will have a better story to tell about South Africa?
I'm glad to tell you that we don't have to do it in 3 months, because Davos has been postponed. By the way, there's a sort of yes. Nonetheless, I think it's a salient question, and it's a much more immediate question, because at the moment the president is having this investment conference, and also next week is this big conference which is normally in New York, which the JSE hosts. So the president is sort of out there touting for investment, but I think I'm completely in agreement with Richard Quest. You can't like persuade people or strong arm them into investment. You've got to make it the competitive environment in which they're going to want to invest. And if you create that environment, you won't have to have conferences. They will be here. And if you create that growth, they will be here. Because a country that is growing strongly and has friendly policies is one in which, as an investor, you can look to make, a lot of money going into the future. And I think the goodwill and so on is still there. I think it's government that actually has to trust the private sector. It's not the other way around. It's got to trust that if it lets go and it puts the policies in place that will encourage investment, that investment will come, that growth will come, and we will all, in the end, be better off. There will be more jobs and there will be more growth, because there isn't really another alternative.
Could you comment about the bailout of SAA and other state-owned institutions? What is the impact of all that on our situation?
In this latest budget, a lot of the attention has been on the 10.5 billion to South African Airways, which, as we know, is a complete waste of money, and the notion that a new airline is going to grow up in an environment in which old airlines have been closing down, and in which the International Air Travel Association doesn't expect passenger volumes to recover for the next 3-4 years, is just totally nonsensical. They have no track record. Fortunately, domestically in South Africa, we're getting some new airlines and a revival of activity. We actually don't need South African Airways, to be perfectly honest. The 10 billion, in a budget of 1.8 trillion, which is what our budget is very small money. I think the important thing was how bad a signal it gave. That, I think, is why it attracted so much attention. Here you are taking money from health budgets to pay for a rescue for SA. It's not even a rescue, it's just paying South Africa's existing liabilities that have been run up over many years of really gross mismanagement. And we've seen that play out at the Zondo Commission, how gross the mismanagement and the corruption actually was. So I think the signal was a very bad one. And I do hope that Pravin Gordhan, the Public Enterprise Minister, and the people around him and the cabinet finally accept that this airline needs to be dead and buried. We've paid the liabilities, we've paid off the staff, we've paid off the unflown tickets, because that's all in the 10.5 billion. We've paid all those creditors. We must shut it down. This is the best time to shut it down, because we basically don't need them. There's plenty of capacity given how low the demand is going to be. And this is the moment to retreat with honor and say, okay, guys, bad time. Let's say goodbye to this airline. We can have an SAA, but there's no reason a private sector operator shouldn't operate under that brand. We, as national carrier, would be lovely. British Airways is privately owned. Swiss Air is privately owned. Qantas is privately owned. And yeah, I think there are lots of airline models which would give us the kind of flag carrier if we wanted, and would give us the aviation industry we want, and would not require these endless amounts of taxpayer money going into a totally dysfunctional state-owned entity. And I think the same goes for a lot of other state-owned entities which need a serious rethink in terms of how they are run and operated.
Well, friends, thanks for watching. Please subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button. And for notifications of new episodes, please click the bell.
It's been another awesome discussion, this time with Hilary Joffe, Associate Contributor to Business Times. It was really good. I hope that some of you, all of you, continue to follow us, interact with us, and ask us difficult questions about what other topics you want us to address in the future. Thank you. Keep following us at Solly Gauta